During my first playthrough of Silksong, I found myself subjected to an absurd form of torture, one entirely of my own design. It started when I stumbled across this writhing mass of vines, one that cried incessantly every time I opened my menu. I spent hours wandering and wondering what to do with these twisted tendrils, carrying them for the majority of the rest of my playthrough. Eventually, I talked to Greyroot, shortly after finishing his Polyp fetch quest. What I originally thought would be a way of ridding myself of the screeching instead turned into a curse, one that stripped me of my crest, my silk abilities and my tools. And from here, I had no idea what to do. I searched and searched, looking for a fix to the problem in every corner of Farloom, and I came to what I now realise was a very silly conclusion. There's probably something in Bilewater, right at the top, right about there. Maybe a boss or some entity that could rid me of this crippling debuff, so I subjected myself to the worst possible version of what many people already consider a terrible addition to the game. A terrible addition to any game, really. The runback. Except this runback was through one of the most punishing areas in the game, full of enemies that seemingly never miss, carving chunks out of my health bar like it's softened butter. I spent hours and hours and hours attempting to climb this gauntlet from the nearest available bench I had, which was all the way back at the exhaust organ. And I was disoriented the entire time, with no easy way of determining my location without the compass that I had up until that point completely relied on. When I finally reached the top, I wasn't presented with a reward or an answer to my problems. Instead, I was battered into the ground by the abomination that is Grohl the Great. So now, I had one of the longest boss runbacks in the game, culminating in one of the most frustrating boss fights, all without any silk abilities, tools, items, or hope. And I honestly loved every second of it. That's not to say I love every runback, or that I recommend people go out of their way to subject themselves to the same ridiculous torture. In fact, I'd recommend you actively avoid it. But this experience made me appreciate the runback in a way I had never really considered before. Runbacks are not popular, not even in the slightest. A quick search will reveal countless Reddit posts and video essays voicing their disdain for what is widely considered one of the worst mechanics in gaming. But after some research, I found that it's far more influential and far more important than it initially seems. The mechanic is synonymous with the early Souls games, with Demon's Souls feeling like it was the first to truly put it into the spotlight. Many of its bosses were preceded by gauntlets that often felt more grueling than the fights themselves. FromSoft continued to include runbacks in each subsequent entry for years, each entry experimenting with length, enemy difficulty and variety, and the general danger of the terrain. Roguelikes also took influence massively from the runback, going as far as to build entire games around the challenge of returning to the boss. Except most of them managed to avoid the frustration through procedurally generated arenas, incremental meta progression, and build variety. Despite how influential and deeply rooted in gaming history they are, that doesn't make runbacks any more palatable. Souls-likes in particular demand a certain degree of mastery, their bosses engineered specifically to push players out of their comfort zone to the limits of concentration and their mechanical ability. But pushing players like this starts to have profound physiological effects. Spikes in adrenaline, elevated heart rates, and a slow tightening of the muscles as stress takes over during a fight's climax. When both the boss and the player only have pixels of health remaining, one mistake means starting over. In their 1908 study, Robert Yerkes and John Dodson established what we now call the inverted U relationship between arousal and performance. Their research on mice showed that performance on a task was best at a moderate state of arousal, a state which they induced with mild electric shocks, while performance suffered at both higher and lower stress levels. It may seem a little barbaric, but this was the foundational research for the theory of arousal regulation. No, not that kind of arousal. The idea is pretty simple. Optimal performance occurs within a sweet spot of stimulation. Too little, and the attention drifts. Too much, and an overwhelming stress leads to mistakes, frustration, and eventually fatigue. Burks and Dodson used electricity to control this state, Silksong instead uses its runbacks. If developers are able to find the right balance, they can push players into a state of optimal performance, better known as flow. And when that happens, time just disappears. The key word being if. Unfortunately, reaching that equilibrium is not a simple task. It's a delicate balancing act, one that demands keeping players absorbed without pushing them too far off either end of the scale, and as such, there are two major ways a runback can fail: overtuned difficulty and excessive length. The worst runbacks in any game are the ones that feel way longer than necessary, devoid of any rhythm, challenge, or purpose. Runbacks so drawn out they sometimes eclipse the boss fight itself. Few examples illustrate this better than Demon Souls, Lud and Zalin. DLC bosses in the Souls games are supposed to be a step up in difficulty, a chance for players to test their skills after mastering the systems. That remains true here, however, when the approach to the boss is this dire, there's very little that can redeem it. The runback takes several minutes through a blizzard thick enough to obscure every discernible landmark. It's hard to commit the path to memory, and I often found myself sprinting blindly, roughly in the right direction, just hoping for the best. Like many other runbacks, it feels less like a challenge tuned to match the boss, and more like a punishment that is purposefully excessive. The more recent entries in the franchise feel like a direct response to that criticism, with Elden Ring reflecting the changing mentality of its players. Most encounters sit within touching distance of a site of grace, and the stakes of Marika provide even more immediate checkpoints that allow for near instant retries. Almost no one misses the old way, and the faster cadence of Elden Ring objectively enhance the experience, removing the frustrations without dulling the edge of the challenge. This shift in design philosophy echoes broader changes in how people play games now, compared to 5, 10 or even 15 years ago. Back then, the length or scope of a game was often tied directly to its value, and although that remains partially true, people value their time more. Those who grew up playing the early Souls games are now much older and most likely much busier. Nowadays, I struggle to carve out even a few short play sessions a week between work and commitments to friends and family. Newer games also take pride in being as accessible as possible, particularly in recent years as the gaming population has skyrocketed. Difficulty modifiers and generous checkpoints are as much about convenience as they are about inclusion. They allow as many people as possible to experience a game regardless of their ability, age, or potential physical impairments. And Elden Ring represented a vision in which a game can be streamlined without diminishing its challenge or scope, allowing a wider audience to experience it exactly as the developers intended. That's why Silksong's decision to introduce the runback feels almost anachronistic, but rather than being a step backwards, it works in service of the game, and the experience Team Cherry wanted to create. The difficulty of Silksong's early game felt similar to the mid-game of Hollow Knight, which makes sense for a project originally conceived as DLC. Some boss encounters are tough, extremely tough in fact, and dying at the final slither of health in a multi-phase fight is infuriating. Knowing that I would have to ascend the entirety of Bilewater just for another attempt at killing that grotesque bug only added to the emotional stress of failure. But for me, in that moment, the runback earned its place. It was necessary, a stretch of breathing room between attempts, and although it was long, mechanically demanding, and the resources I had to work with were scarce, many of the enemies on the return to the boss shared attacks with Grohl himself. A subtle way for the developers to teach the fight during the downtime rather than making it entirely trial and error. It's something you can see repeated throughout the game. The runback also complements the game's Metroidvania structure. These games aren't just about beating bosses or uncovering the story, although that is arguably the most entertaining part. They're about learning to navigate the environment safely and efficiently, finding shortcuts and hidden passageways, mastering the layout of a world dense with environmental storytelling. The repetition invited me to commit the map to memory as I fumbled my way back through unfamiliar corridors. But each subsequent run began to feel like a mini speedrun. How quickly could I get back to Grohl while still conserving enough health for the fight itself? There's a balance of risk and reward in those moments. Should I explore that alternate pathway, knowing I might die to a trap, a mini-boss, or another one of those homing darts that seems physically impossible to dodge? But maybe if I'd taken that risk, I would have found that bench that would have cut my run back in half, making the entire ordeal a lot easier. Easy to say with the benefit of hindsight. At the end of the day, the runback is a reminder that good game design isn't always about convenience. Silksong operates on a philosophy inherited from those early Souls games, ones of challenge and mastery. Its design isn't there to frustrate, but to control pacing, enhance immersion, and eke every last drop of performance out of the player. Not everyone will enjoy that approach, and that's okay. We all have different schedules, skill levels, and tolerances for mindlessly sprinting through barwater, but for me, Silksong struck a balance that felt perfect for the experience it wanted to create. My silly mistake only heightened the sense of isolation and dread that comes from exploring new and dangerous environments. Silksong is demanding, thought-provoking, and occasionally infuriating, but it never felt hollow, and it achieved that in part by embracing one of gaming's most hated mechanics. And sometimes the thing we hate most about a game is the thing that makes it unforgettable.